Hi, welcome to week 4 of History 358. We ended last week with an analysis and narrative of the events of 1917, February Revolution that brought down the Tsar, the October Revolution that brought down the provisional government and allowed the Bolsheviks to assume power and begin the task of creating the world's first socialist state. And that's the topic that I want to focus on in the lectures for this week. Having taken power, what do the Bolsheviks do with it? How do they hold on to it? I'm going to switch over to the slides here and show you where we're going this week. Back up a little bit. So I want to think about this question of the Bolsheviks in power. And again, how do the Bolsheviks retain power? I think this is a very interesting question that has a lot to tell us about the style of Bolshevik rule. You can press pause and write these down if you like. These are, again, just a kind of roadmap of where we're going to be going in this lecture today. I should mention that in the weeks that followed the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks seizing power in the capital, Petrograd, there are copycat mini Octobers, if you will, that take place in the various cities and urban centers across Russia. In towns where the Bolsheviks had a majority of seats on the city Soviet, the city Soviet declares that they are seizing power on behalf of the workers and peasants. In cities and towns where there was a bit more contestation, a division of power, a division of support for both Bolsheviks and other socialist alternatives. There's street fighting, there's clashes. The most violent of this occurred in Moscow, where again, some 200 or 300 people were killed in the fighting. I mentioned the memoirs of Edouard Dunet, the young teenage factory worker who became a Red Guard and sided with the Bolsheviks. You can get a flavor of that, of the events in Moscow in October 17 from reading Dunet's memoir, Notes of a Red Guard. Elena Elitskaya, in our readings for last week, talks a little bit about the disorder and the tumult that followed the Bolsheviks seizing power in the provincial city of Kursk. Again, though, worth bearing in mind that the February Revolution had witnessed a greater loss of life than the October Revolution. The October Revolution, a relatively bloodless event that would soon become a very bloody event, as we'll see. I want to, again, you can come back to these slides, this initial slide if you like, but I want to show you a painting here. This is a much later painting from the 1940s, 1950s, done in the so-called socialist realist style, which we'll talk about when we get to the Stalin period. But it commemorates and valorizes the storming of the Winter Palace. And as the Bolsheviks begin writing the history of their revolution, the founding of the Bolshevik regime, the Soviet state, the storming of the Winter Palace becomes mythologized as this symbolic, critical, decisive moment in the revolution. It becomes the key element, the key component, I think, in the Soviet origin story, the foundational myth. And this is common in revolutions. If you think back to the French Revolution, the American Revolution before it, events, pivotal events like the storming of the Bastille in July of 1789, or the Boston Tea Party or the Boston Massacre, right? These pivotal moments become the focus of the story of the revolution, right? This is how the revolution starts. This is the kind of crystallized kernel of the revolution itself. And so October and the storming of the Winter Palace becomes a very important component of the origin story that the Bolsheviks tell about the regime they're building, the new socialist order that they're building. And as I mentioned last week, the storming of the Winter Palace becomes this theatricalized event. It's reenacted on stage. Here you see some still photographs from the biggest of the reenactments of the storming of the Winter Palace, this from 1920. Some of the leading theatrical designers and impresarios of the Soviet or Russian stage were impressed into service by the Bolsheviks to choreograph these huge spectacles with thousands upon thousands of participants. The Winter Palace is re-stormed numerous times in the years that follow by these hordes of reenactors organized very carefully by state and party officials. So these serve the purpose of participatory spectacles. And it serves the purpose of involving those who were not there in this story. So reenacting the storming of the Winter Palace becomes a way of putting that moment at the very center of the mythology of October. And when I say mythology, I don't mean that it's fake or false, but it becomes an important and repeated story, right? Myths serve this purpose of telling us who we are, how we got here. And so for the Bolshevik regime, these participatory, choreographed mass spectacles serve that very important pedagogical purpose of explaining what the revolution is all about, explaining the new society we're building, the old society that we have torn down. And if you're interested in reading more about these kind of big theatrical spectacles, the historian James von Geldern has written about this extensively. I can point you in the direction of some articles and books that he's authored if you'd like to read more about this. There's also some clips on YouTube of this 1920 reenactment if you want to see a little bit more of it. Last week I mentioned and put under recommended viewing the 1927 film The End of St. Petersburg, Koniec Sankt Peterburga, directed by Vsevolod Pudovkin. This was one of the first cinematic treatments of 1917, and it tells the story through the eyes of a young radicalized peasant who becomes a worker, who becomes a Bolshevik, who participates in the events of October. And you see the story of the revolution through the eyes of this, politically aware, politically active young member of the proletariat. So if you have the time and the interest, I'd recommend checking out that film. An even more famous one directed by Sergei Eisenstein called October. And that also depicts, again, in cinematic form, the events of 1917 from start to finish, the culmination being, of course, the storming of the Winter Palace. I mention these films not only because they're great works of art and bear viewing, I think, on their own, but also because it's a good example of how the Bolsheviks from early on impressed the arts into their vision of creating a new society, using theater, using visual arts, using film to propagate, distribute, spread their message, to soak that message in to the people, the minds of the people. And we'll talk more about the use of propaganda as we move forward. Here's another photograph, this from 1927, commemorating the 10-year anniversary of the revolution on Red Square in the heart of Moscow. And you see the Red Guards in the front bearing a banner that reads, "Workers of the world, unite," that famous last line from Marx's Communist Manifesto. Here in the background, you see Lenin's mausoleum. Lenin is dead in 24. We'll talk about the commemoration and almost deification of Lenin that follows his death. But I wanted you to see that picture I think it's a very remarkable photograph. Look how dirty it is, muddy. This is just kind of a bit of Soviet kitsch from the 1920s, a commemorative plate with accompanying figurines, a sailor, a peasant woman, a soldier, worker, militiaman, and this sort of colored, painted commemorative plate that says, "The kingdom of workers and peasants shall have no end." Again, reflecting that almost kind of biblical end of days prophecy from Marxist doctrine that the old world will crumble, the new world will replace it, and the new world shall endure forever. We'll enter into the communist utopia. Everything will be happy. Everything will be blissful. Uh, Class conflict will have come to an end. And so you see already this kind of celebratory uh, culture surrounding the revolution. The revolution becomes, again, the kind of founding moment. Go back to these terms just in case you need them again. But as we saw in the 1938 short course, and as you see too in the films that I mentioned, End of St. Petersburg and October, the Bolshevik Party is shown always in proper Leninist terms as the revolutionary vanguard, guiding the workers forward, calling the shots. But the party was not all-knowing. The party was not omniscient. The party leaders are uncertain, having taken power, what to do with it. Once the dust settles from the October Revolution, the question facing Lenin, Trotsky, and the Bolshevik leadership is, what now? We've toppled the old order. How do we build the new one? Lenin, in the weeks after the October Revolution, delivered an interesting speech in which he said, "We Bolsheviks do not pretend that Marx or Marxists know the road to socialism in detail. That is nonsense," he says. "We know the direction of the road, but concretely, practically, how we get there will have to be shown by the experience of millions of workers and peasants when they choose to act." In other words, what Lenin is saying here is, we know where we're going. We're going from capitalism into socialism. From socialism, we will move forward into communism. But how exactly will we get there? What's the roadmap? Marx and Engels back in the 19th century had been maddeningly vague on this question. Marx had famously said, anyone who makes plans for after the revolution is a counter-revolutionary. So the Bolsheviks are faced with this task, as I mentioned in last week's discussion, of trying to sort of improvise their way to socialism. So what I want to do is talk about some of the difficulties that the Bolsheviks faced as they sought to establish their new regime, as they sought to hold on to power. So we'll talk about these questions essentially of state formation. How did the Bolsheviks create out of the rubble of World War I and the rubble of revolution and the rubble of the civil war that will soon ensue? How did the Bolsheviks manage to build a state apparatus? Right? How do they create what Marx called the dictatorship of the proletariat? And what we'll see is that the Bolsheviks succeed in creating a one-party state, right? The multiplicity of ideas that had flowered during the February Revolution are shut down. And in the weeks that follow October, a unitary one-party state, a Bolshevik regime, is created. And the Bolsheviks will use coercive means, as we'll see, against their political opponents. The slogan that had propelled the Bolsheviks to power, all power to the Soviets, all power to the councils of workers, soldiers, sailors, and poor peasants, really becomes all power to the party, all power to the Bolshevik party. So, how to retain power? As I mentioned, the Mensheviks and SRs had stormed out of the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets in October, when they learned that the Bolsheviks had launched this armed insurrection in the streets of Petrograd. So the walkout of the Mensheviks and SR, as they're heckled by Trotsky, right? Trotsky says, go into the dustbin of history where you belong. Having walked out in protest, the Mensheviks and SRs have essentially left the Bolsheviks in complete control of the Congress, which provides the legal fiction for Lenin and the Bolsheviks to say, now we are creating a new regime. The Bolshevik majority left in the hall uses its power to announce the formation of a Bolshevik government. The Soviets are now in power. The councils are now in power. But really what the Bolsheviks mean is that the party, the Bolshevik party, is now in control, and we will rule in the name of the people. We will rule on behalf of the Soviets. So a new Bolshevik government is created in the wake of the October Revolution. And one of the first questions facing Lenin and his comrades is, what do we call the government? Nomenclature, naming practice is very important here. We can't use the word, we can't use what other European countries use, what capitalist countries use. We're not going to talk about ministers or secretaries, right? These are words and titles that have unsavory capitalist connotations, right? It conjures up images of top-hatted capitalists with sacks of money. The word minister, in its government sense, as Lenin says, is a foul, worn-out, ragged term. So the title that the Bolsheviks settle on after October is commissar. And unlike the word minister, commissar had a very distinguished revolutionary pedigree. The Bolsheviks are always looking back to recent history for revolutionary inspiration. And the socialist radicals who had briefly taken power in Paris during the year of the Paris Commune, 1870, had used the title commissar to refer to their short-lived government. And so as an homage to their revolutionary forebears, the Bolsheviks adopt the title commissar for the leaders of their new government. The word itself, incidentally, comes from the Latin commissarius, which means a person who is in charge. So the new Bolshevik government is known as the Council of People's Commissars. In Russian, Soviet Narodnych Komissarov, or Sovnarkom. The Bolsheviks were fond of creating these portmanteau words, smashing long words together using the first syllable from a multi-word phrase. So the Council of People's Commissars, or Sovnarkom, is the new government. Lenin is the chairman of the Council of People's Commissars. Trotsky becomes the Commissar for Foreign Affairs. Soon thereafter, he becomes the Commissar for War. One of the Bolshevik intellectuals, Anatoly Lunacharsky, becomes the People's Commissar of Enlightenment, essentially the man in charge of educational policy and culture building, which we'll talk more about next week. Joseph Stalin is involved in the new government. He is the Commissar for Nationalities Affairs. In other words, the commissar who is in charge of juggling and managing the multi-ethnic population of the empire. And here you see a photo of, not the empire, of the new Bolshevik state, the former empire. Here you see a photograph of the members of Sovnarkom, the commissars of the new Bolshevik government. Lenin is kind of slouching here, Stalin with a cigarette in his lips, standing, as always, as close to Lenin as possible. There's a People's Commissar for Agriculture, a People's Commissar for Industry, one for Railroads, a Commissar of Justice, a Commissar of Food Supply, so forth and so on. These positions are filled rather haphazardly. Lenin and his comrades select men and women on the basis of their party loyalty, their party credentials, more so than on the basis of actual experience. Remember, the Bolsheviks are professional revolutionaries. Few of them had worked an honest day's job in their life. They had spent their entire student years and adult lives in the revolutionary underground. So credentials had to be improvised. To give you an example, when Lenin and the Bolsheviks were looking for a new director of the state bank, which they had occupied and taken over, Lenin said, well, what about Kristinsky? Nikolai Kristinsky was an old Bolshevik, a trusted fellow. Kristinsky's only qualifications for serving as the new director of the state bank is that he had sat in on a few economics lectures at the London School of Economics while he was living in exile in Britain. Not exactly a glittering resume. One of Lenin's comrades, in fact, who had been sort of drafted into the new government, tried to beg off and say, I don't know anything about railroads. I don't know anything about factories. How can you put me in charge of this? And Lenin said, do you really think that any of us has any experience in any of this? The party needs you. Do your duty. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the Bolsheviks start to build this revolutionary world with only the vaguest sense of how to go about it, and with very limited practical experience of actual governance. Right? The Bolsheviks are going from being an illegal underground revolutionary party to now calling the shots. That's a radical transformation. One historian has described it as a utopia in power. A bunch of dreamers and schemers and thinkers have now found themselves propelled inexplicably into a position of authority, into a position of power. And that's a very radical transformation. In fact, one of the early commissars on Sovnarkom said that it took him and his comrades a while to get used to the fact that they were now in charge. He said that, we were worried any day that the enemies of the revolution would burst into our meeting hall and arrest us. So the new commissar for internal affairs, for instance, a man named Petrovsky, who's one of the sources we're reading this week, Petrovsky, in his memoirs, said, we did not even know how to set about the job. We had to resort for advice to the office messengers and clerks who had worked in the department for decades and had seen dozens of bosses change. So the Bolsheviks in power have to kind of rely, if you will, on the good graces of the bureaucratic stratum, the civil servants who remain in their jobs. One of the first commissars, in fact, the very first woman to hold a ministerial position in a European government, was an old party member named Alexandra Kollontai. And we're going to be reading more of Kollontai in next week's meeting. Kollontai was a Bolshevik who was very concerned with the question of the role of women in the new revolutionary society. What would women's role be? What would the family look like? What would childcare look like? What would marriage be like? And so we'll read some of Kollontai's readings and writings and discuss them next week. Here you see a photograph of Kollontai addressed to the American journalist Louise Bryant. To dear comrade Louise Bryant, from her friend Alexandra Kollontai, dated August 1st, 1918, or September 1st, 1918, the Bolshevik convention, the European convention of putting the month before or after, rather, the date. So a nice little autograph of Kollontai. Kollontai was named the first People's Commissar for Social Welfare. And it was Kollontai who was in charge of trying to set up institutions for support for veterans, war widows, orphans, etc. So I wanted to introduce Kollontai now because we'll talk more about her next week. So a very inauspicious beginning, a group of amateurs having stumbled into power now have to hold on to it. And observers at the time said, this isn't going to last. One of the leaders of the SR party said the Bolsheviks will get 2 weeks and then they're going to fall. One of the Menshevik leaders placed a bet and said, I'll give them 3 weeks, and that's it. They're going to crumble. So there was not a great deal of confidence that this new Bolshevik regime would last. In fact, Lunacharsky, the People's Commissar of Enlightenment, wrote to his wife in the days after October. He said, things are so unstable here that every time I break off from writing you this letter, I don't know if I'll be able to resume. I could at any minute be thrown into jail. The point of all of this is to emphasize just how weak the new government was, the new regime was, when the Bolsheviks took power in October of 1917. The new government, again, was made up of revolutionaries who had spent their entire adult lives dreaming about this moment. And now they have the opportunity to put their dreams into practice. And that's the classic Marxist philosophical problem of implementing theory into practice. How do you translate the page, the written word, the idea, into reality? The new government takes immediate steps to implement its famous slogan of 1917, land, peace, and bread. So I want to just talk very quickly about some of these early Bolshevik decrees, a couple of which I've listed here. The Decree on Land was issued on October 26th, 1917, by the new Bolshevik government, and at the stroke of a pen, it outlawed private ownership of land. Land would be taken from landowners who would not be compensated, mind you, for their loss, and the land would be redistributed to peasant families on an egalitarian basis, so that families who were larger would get a little bit more land, smaller families, older couples without children in the home would get smaller parcels of land. And the decree said that the distribution will be handled by village and district level committees of peasants and party members who will work together to redistribute the land. Now, land, of course, had been an important part of the Bolshevik program in 1917. The SRs, too, had been calling for redistribution of land, but the Bolsheviks, now empowered, seek to implement that slogan, to put it into practice. And it was a very clever attempt on the part of the Bolsheviks to shore up popular support, to win popular support in the countryside, where Bolshevik support was very weak. Most peasants were behind the SR party. The Bolsheviks, again, are predominantly an urban party. Their support is with the workers, with the soldiers, with the sailors, not so much in the countryside. So the Decree on Land is, in some way, a Bolshevik co-option, or, if you prefer, stealing of that central plank of the SR party. Looking ahead to the Stalin years, the Decree on Land, which gave land to the peasants, will be revoked when Stalin begins his process of collectivizing agriculture, creating large collective farms and throwing the peasants on them. Just a few days after the Decree on Land, the Bolsheviks issue a decree on worker control, giving elected factory committees made up of workers the power to control and supervise the work performed in industrial factories, manufacturing plants, so that the workers, in principle, now control the means of production. All of this land and worker control decree, all of this is coming straight out of the sort of Marxist playbook. While the workers are empowered, their right to organize is upheld in the Decree on Workers' Control. The workers are given these rights. What happens in reality is that the workers' unions become controlled by the party. They become another arm of party control. So these decrees that seem so liberating, that seem so emancipatory, in fact, put the peasants and the workers under the direct supervision and control of party authority. The other notable decree that I want to talk about here briefly is the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So with the redistribution of land, you've got land, worker control is bread, land, peace, and bread. Peace is the third piece, third plank of that tripartite slogan, and the Bolsheviks scurry to make peace with their German enemies. On October 27th, true to their word, the Bolsheviks announce an immediate armistice with Germany. They're going to stop fighting. And in December, Bolshevik delegates, Bolshevik envoys, sent by the government, sent by Sovnarkom, travel by train to the border town of Brest-Litovsk to negotiate with the German and Austrian diplomats and generals. And here you can see two of the Germans, of course, in their spiky helmets. You see Trotsky and Adolf Joffe representing the Bolsheviks for the negotiations at Brest-Litovsk. The party was divided. The party leaders were divided on how to strike a deal, strike a peace with the Germans. Trotsky, in fact, was sort of dragging his heels during the negotiations, hoping to stall the negotiations because Trotsky was convinced that any day now, the German workers and the Austrian workers will follow the lead of the Russian workers and launch their global socialist revolution. Remember, the Bolsheviks are banking on this, right? They don't think that they're going to go it alone. They think that they have toppled the first of all the socialist revolutionary dominoes that are going to fall around the world. Other people in the party, Nikolai Bukharin, proposed that we shouldn't negotiate at all. We should fight a guerrilla war of resistance and bring socialist revolution to Germany by force of arms. The party leaders are divided on this. Lenin solves the fractious debate. He says, we need an immediate peace with Germany. Our new Bolshevik regime, he says, cannot survive in the midst of war. We need, quote, breathing space. And in fact, Lenin says, if the party doesn't get behind me on this, I will resign as chair of the Council of People's Commissars, as chair of Sovnarkom. So we either sign the peace now with Germany, Lenin says, or we sign the new regime's death warrant 3 weeks down the road. So Lenin uses his influence in the party to push forward this peace with Germany. And Trotsky and the other Bolshevik negotiators at Brest-Litovsk accede to Lenin's wishes. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March of 1918, strips the old Western provinces away from the new government. The Soviet state recognizes the independence of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Poland, Bessarabia, Ukraine, and the loss of territory here in the South Caucasus on the borders of the soon-to-fall Ottoman Empire. 34% of the population of Soviet Russia is lost at the stroke of a pen the minute Trotsky signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. 55 million people in these now lost territories. Russia loses 34% of its population, 32% of its agricultural land, 54% of its factories and industrial plants, 89% of its coal mines, which are needed to fuel the turbines and engines of industry. Now, over the next couple of years, during the Civil War, Ukraine will be brought back in parts of Belarus will be brought back in. But we might stop and think, why would the new Bolshevik government have signed such a punishing peace with Germany? Lenin said it doesn't matter. Sign it away now. Sign even more away, because the worldwide socialist revolution is just around the corner. The revolution is coming. The entire world will join us. So it doesn't matter if we lose Ukraine now. It doesn't matter if we lose Finland now, because the whole world is about to rise up. The socialist revolution will sweep the globe. And the Bolsheviks hold on to this thinking through at least the first half of the 1920s. And when that dream fails to materialize, it obliges the new government to rethink its foreign policy, rethink its global strategy. And that's a task that will fall to Lenin's ultimate successor, Stalin. So it's with that ideological vision in mind of imminent revolution right around the corner that the Bolsheviks signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. A few other revolutionary decrees, again, give you some sense of how the Bolsheviks are setting about this task of creating a new order. A decree from November of 1917 creates a new legal system. It abolishes the old judicial system that had existed under the czars and creates a new proletarian workers' justice system. Special revolutionary tribunals, special revolutionary courts would be set up at the local level by the local councils, the local Soviets, to deal with problems like economic speculation, war profiteering, sabotage. So the judicial system is overhauled. The revolution also seeks to invert the existing social structures of the old society. So decrees abolishing titles, decrees abolishing rank, the old hierarchies that had existed in Tsarist society are abolished. It used to be in Russian that those social hierarchies were reflected in the modes of address, in the very language that Russian men and women used when talking to their social superiors. If you were a peasant, you referred to your landlord as barin, as master. You referred to members of the old propertied class as господин, or sir. Those terms of address had been phased out over the course of 1917 as the whole social structure came falling down. They had become terms of abuse. To be called a bourgeois, to be called a member of the bourgeoisie, was a slap in the face. And now the Bolsheviks legalize that inversion of social order by abolishing these old terms, literally decreeing the form of language that can be used. The Bolshevik regime declares that individuals are to be addressed simply as citizen. And if you're a party member, man or woman, you are addressed fraternally as comrade. And again, that idea that you address your fellow men and women as citizen harkens back to the egalitarian spirit of the French Revolution. Last week, I asked you to sort of think about in your journal entries sort of who is on board the Bolshevik revolutionary train and who isn't, right? Revolutions are inclusive acts, but they're also exclusionary acts too. They draw lines, both legal and sociocultural, between who belongs and who doesn't. The new regime declares civil and legal restrictions against so-called former people. And this is a term I want to go back to from the beginning. The Russian phrase is бывшие люди, former people. And it's kind of a chilling phrase when you think about it. By former people, the new Bolshevik government meant those individuals, members of social classes who had wielded power and privilege under the old regime. They are now former people. There is no place for them in the new worker and peasant government. There is no room for them in the new revolutionary society. The terms, the category, who belongs to this category of bывшие люди, former noblemen, aristocrats, members of the bourgeoisie, liberals, members of the cadets, all opposition party members, SRs, Mensheviks, liberal cadets, czarist officers in the former czarist army, Orthodox priests and clergymen. All of these so-called former people are now, by law, politically disenfranchised. They have no power in the new worker and peasant state. They are stripped of their voting rights. The first Soviet constitution, issued in 1918, formalizes this reality that the bывшие люди, the former people, are stripped of their civil and political rights. Now, it's a clear sign that the new regime will not be friendly toward the former elites. And in fact, anyone with the wherewithal, anyone with the means to do so, chooses to leave. So noblemen flee the new Soviet state. They head off to Paris, Prague, Berlin. Some make their way to America, others to Constantinople, Istanbul, some to the Chinese city of Harbin, which becomes a kind of Far Eastern refuge for Russian emigres. But you have this mass wave of emigration following the revolution, as men and women who recognize that their class origins and their social privilege, if you will, make them outcasts in this new revolutionary society, and they get the hell out. And you see here some former nobleman here on the right, an aristocrat, a dandy who is packing his bags and leaving Russia. This is a cartoon from the time, an anti-Bolshevik cartoon, satirizing this kind of social reversal. We see some disheveled, probably drunken, given the bottles on the floor and the smashed glasses, Bolshevik workers, radicalized workers who have taken over the quarters of a noble mansion in Petrograd. You see the bayonet lying up against the couch, the divan. They're smoking the hand-rolled papyrosi that the lower class would smoke at this time. If you've ever been to Russia, you know that you can see right away that these two men have broken one of the strongest social taboos. They have not removed their shoes while going into the living space of this mansion. You're supposed to take off your shoes. It's the polite, proper thing to do. These thugs in this anti-Bolshevik cartoon are wearing their boots, and even worse, putting their boots up on the furniture. My God. So this is, again, an anti-Bolshevik portrayal of a world that's turned upside down. Those outcasts are now in power. Those who did hold power and privilege are now out the door. Reflected in this photograph, you see on the right a former noblewoman whose fortunes have evaporated now after the revolution. She's reduced to selling newspapers on the streets of Petrograd. And here, a terrific photograph, again, showing that kind of inversion of social power. A former czarist officer on the left is polishing the boots of Red Guard Bolsheviks. So that, the czarist army had been very hierarchically structured. Officers held enormous power over enlisted men. Officers addressed enlisted men by the informal you, while enlisted men were expected to address their officers in the formal you. Those of you who've studied Russian or other European languages know that there's that delicate linguistic distinction between between these two kinds of you, right? There's the you use when talking to friends and family and peers. There's the you use when you're talking to social superiors. Um, and that was reflected again in the kind of culture of czarist society more generally, but particularly in the army. So this is a shocking sight for a czarist officer to be polishing the boots of an enlisted Red Guard Bolshevik. Again, reflecting this idea of a world turned upside down. A couple other quick decrees to go through. January 23rd, 1918, the Bolsheviks passed the decree on the separation of church and state. This is a landmark decree issued by Sovnarkom, the Council of People's Commissars. The Russian Orthodox Church, which had been the official legal religion of the Russian Empire, now loses its privileged legal status. Religious organizations of all types, the Russian Orthodox Church, various Protestant organizations, Jewish organizations, Catholic, all forbidden from owning land and owning property. The educational curriculum, which we'll talk more about next week, is overhauled. Religious instruction, which had been an important part of the curriculum under the czars, is taken out. A completely secular, indeed atheist-oriented curriculum is introduced. And the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, according to the decree on the separation of church and state, loses the power that it held over the daily lives of Russian subjects. Prior to the revolution, the church had controlled life events, baptism, marriage, divorce, which was hardly ever granted. If you've read Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, you know how impossible it was to get a divorce in Tsarist Russia. So all of these life rituals that had been celebrated under the auspices of the traditional sacraments of the Russian Orthodox Church are taken out of the hands of the church and made into secular state ceremonies. Weddings are taken out of churches and put into city halls. Divorce, as we'll see next week, becomes a simple civic process, just filling out a form, making it so. So we'll talk more about the church when we talk about culture building, but basically what the Soviets are trying to do, what the Bolsheviks are trying to do here, is remake the cultural landscape. So all of these decrees, seen as part of a larger project of economic, political, legal, and cultural reconstruction, right? Revolutions try to remake society in the image of the ideologues who are pushing the revolution forward. And that's exactly what the Bolsheviks are doing here. So at every turn, vestiges and symbols of the old regime are tossed out. The new regime introduces new symbols. Right? The old czarist anthem, "God Save the Tsar," is obviously now unsuited for the national anthem of the new socialist regime. The Bolsheviks adopt the Internationale, the global socialist hymn, as their new national anthem. And we'll talk about the lyrics to that later on. In March of 1918, the Bolsheviks moved the capital from Petrograd, Petersburg, to Moscow. Why? For logistical reasons. Even though the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is about to be signed, the German armies are perilously close to Petrograd. The Civil War is brewing and about to begin. Anti-Bolshevik armies, white armies as they're called, are forming and threatening Petrograd. So the Bolsheviks moved the capital from its historic site of St. Petersburg, where the Russian capital had been since 1700, and they moved back to the old medieval Russian capital of Moscow. Again, for logistical reasons. Moscow is more centralized. It's a better transportation and communication hub, and it's farther from the enemies that are massing and threatening with the brewing civil war. So Lenin and the Soviet government set up shop in the old czarist fortress of the Kremlin. Here you see uh, moving day as the old as the new government is preparing to head out of its Petrograd headquarters and relocate to Moscow. And the new government relocates somewhat incongruously to the Kremlin at the very heart, in the very heart of Moscow. The Kremlin, in Russian Kreml, was the old fortress, the old citadel that stood in the heart of medieval Moscow. And every old Russian town had its own citadel, its own Kremlin, its own fortress. But Moscow's Kremlin was the Kremlin, the Kremlin. Filled with churches, filled with holy relics, filled with pealing bells from church towers. It was a very incongruous sight for the new revolutionary government to set up shop. Um, Trotsky, in fact, writes that with its medieval walls and its gilded bell towers, the Kremlin was an utter paradox as a fortress for the new revolutionary dictatorship. Um, the Bolsheviks will tear down some churches, they'll put up red flags, they'll even recalibrate the chimes in the bell tower so that instead of playing God Save the Tsar, the bell towers will ring forth with the revolutionary strains of the Internationale. So, as this image shows, the Bolsheviks are kind of recasting the Kremlin as the citadel of global revolution, from being the site of the Tsar's coronations in centuries past, the center of Holy Rus, the center of Holy Russia. It's now been transformed into the beating heart of the global revolution. And you can see here from the church tower the banner of the RSFSR, the Russian Socialist Federated Soviet Republic. And on the walls of the Kremlin, long live the Internationale, long live the global socialist revolution. I want to talk a little bit about revolutionary iconoclasm, which we touched on in our discussion of February. You'll recall those symbols of Tsarist authority that had been torn off of buildings by angry demonstrators and crowds and thrown into the icy waters of the Fontanka Canal. There's an iconoclastic dimension to revolutions. And by iconoclastic, I mean literally, literally the word comes to us from the Greek for image breaking or image smashing. But revolutions, the French, the American, the Russian, the Chinese revolution later on, all great revolutions have this iconoclastic dimension. They seek to smash the symbols that represent the old order, tear them down, and reintroduce new symbols that represent what the new order stands for. So making Russia red, making Russia in the Bolsheviks' image after October means that you have to strip Russia of its visual czarist legacy. So here's an example of that. This is a statue that had been erected in the 19th century to commemorate one of the great heroes of the Russo-Turkish War from the 1870s. It's torn down now by the Bolsheviks as a hated symbol of czarist imperialist oppression. Ripped down. Here, famously, in the late 20s, very end of the 1920s, the Bolsheviks tear down this huge church in the background, and they also rip down this enormous cast iron statue of Tsar Alexander III, the father of Nicholas II. These big orchestrated demolition projects, these big choreographed acts of public demolition were meant to send a message, just like the reenactments of the October Revolution were meant to project a message. The demolition of these symbols of czarist authority were meant to show that the old ways have come to an end, right? The old ways have fallen. They've been discredited by their very failure. And a new dispensation, a new order has come to pass. So visual symbols of the old order must come crashing down. just to give you some sense of how huge this statue was. Here you see some little kids posing with the fallen head of Alexander III. This process of revolutionary iconoclasm, tearing down, smashing symbols of the old order, took place all across Soviet Russia. It took place in the provinces. Here are some archival photographs from the Siberian town of Tomsk. And you see here Romanov symbols being removed from the city post office and the city hall of justice. Here too, Romanov eagles being removed from the big department store in downtown Tomsk. Revolutionary iconoclasm, in all of its sort of historical contexts, involves not only the tearing down of new symbols, but again, the erection of new ones. And here you see a photograph of party leaders in Moscow unveiling a monument in honor of the French revolutionary hero Georges Danton. Curious, you might say, that the Bolsheviks would go to such lengths as erecting a massive monument in honor of a French revolutionary hero from more than 100 years ago. But it's a good example of how the Bolsheviks were very interested in establishing themselves as part of this kind of revolutionary genealogy. They saw the French revolutionaries as their forebears. The French revolutionaries had brought down the feudal order, ushered in the capitalist order. We, the Bolsheviks, have torn down the capitalist order and are ushering in the socialist order. So there was a great affection, a great fondness that the Bolsheviks had for the most radical of the French revolutionaries, the Jacobins. And they were constantly trying to learn from the mistakes that the Jacobins had made, which we'll turn to in a moment. The revolution must not grow complacent, because if it does, the enemies of the revolution will tear it down. That was the mistake that Robespierre and the Jacobins had made. We, Bolsheviks, must not make that mistake again. Other predictable heroes. This is a horribly rickety monument, which naturally is no longer standing. But you see a blurry photograph of Lenin addressing a crowd of spectators at the unveiling of a monument in honor of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, set up in downtown Moscow. So what the revolution is doing by tearing down statues of generals and czars, by changing the street names of, in honor of saints and czars, in honor of new revolutionary heroes, what they're doing is creating their own pantheon, if you will, of revolutionary martyrs, revolutionary heroes, revolutionary idols who are to be admired. So this commemoration of monumental propaganda, big statues put in public places, is part of the new regime's attempt to legitimate its existence and give visible, teachable form to what the new regime stands for. To give you an example, if you go to Moscow, outside of Red Square, there's a park, a garden called Alexandrovsky Sad, the Alexander Gardens. And there stands in that garden this relatively big obelisk, an Egyptian obelisk that was taken from Egypt in the 19th century when all the European powers were stealing as much as they could of Egyptian artifacts and treasures. The British were notorious for this, of course. But the Russians got their hand, the Romanovs got their hand on an obelisk, and they erected it in Alexandrovsky Sad. And to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the Romanov dynasty, they engraved on this obelisk all the names of the Romanovs, from Mikhail Romanov back in 1613 all the way up to Nicholas II, with room for more to follow. When the Bolsheviks took power, they scrubbed out all of the Romanov names and erected and engraved in their place the name of great revolutionary heroes from Russian history, and putting Lenin at the top of this. So again, establishing a family tree, a genealogy, if you will, of revolutionary activity, tearing down old symbols, creating new ones. I think this is one of the more interesting, sort of fruitful avenues for research in early Soviet history, how these culture building processes take place. And we can talk more about that in weeks to come. So these early decrees that we've talked about, the decree on land, the decree on worker control over factories, the end of the war with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, all of these early policies were aimed at putting into practice the principles of a socialist government, empowering the peasants, empowering the workers, empowering the soldiers and sailors, simultaneously disenfranchising the so-called exploiting class of former people, so that a new privileged society of workers, peasants, soldiers, and sailors emerges from the rubble of the old fallen society. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there is an emancipatory, liberating element to all of this. Early Bolshevik policy, say what you will of the Bolshevik regime, their early policies aimed at making good on their promises to their core constituencies. So you have this message of freedom, you have this message of emancipation that is enormously attractive to those who are being emancipated, to those who are being offered these freedoms. But from the very beginning, and this is the point I want to make clear, there is a contradictory impulse at work. While the Bolsheviks are giving freedom with one hand, they are taking it away with the other. And one clear example of this is the fate of the Constituent Assembly, which we talked briefly about in week 3 discussion, but I want to talk a little bit more here. And I'll wrap up with this, the story of the Constituent Assembly. So what was the Constituent Assembly? Remember that when the provisional government came to power in February, immediately the provisional government declares that we will have national elections in the fall. We will elect a constituent assembly made up of representatives from all across the Russian lands. These representatives to the Constituent Assembly will draft a new constitution for Russia and set us on a new political course, right? This will be kind of our moment to form a new kind of state. And that's why the provisional government, again, called itself provisional. We were going to hold on to power temporarily until the elections were held and the Constituent Assembly could be convened. So when were the elections scheduled? Well, the idea was to have the elections in the fall, and this was an SR idea, because the peasants would be done with the harvest, they'd have brought in the crops, they'd be free to vote, and the SRs would hope that that would give them an electoral edge. The problem with a fall election is that by October, the provisional government is out. The Bolsheviks have taken power. And Lenin and the Council of People's Commissars were faced with a dilemma. Should we let the elections go forward or not? Lenin knew that if the elections went forward, the Bolsheviks would not fare well. They would not do well in the national elections because Bolshevik support, again, was restricted to those urban constituencies. Workers, soldiers, sailors, intellectuals in the urban spaces. Support for the Bolsheviks in the countryside was limited. And again, Russia was an overwhelmingly rural country, so it stands to reason, as Lenin did, that the national elections would turn out poorly for the Bolsheviks. But we can't just cancel the elections, nor can we postpone them indefinitely, because again, the regime is too weak. Lenin and the Bolsheviks recognized that if they simply canceled the elections, there would be a national protest, the government could fall. So what do? Let's just let the elections go forward, Lenin says, and we'll see what happens. So here you see, excuse me, here you see a Bolshevik propaganda poster from the 1917 fall election campaigns, calling upon all politically conscious citizens of the Russian Republic to vote for the Bolshevik ticket, to vote Bolshevik. And you see again that classic slogan, workers of the world unite. So the Bolsheviks are trying to make an appeal to their constituent base to come out and vote the Bolshevik ticket. But as Lenin predicted, the results were unfavorable for the Bolsheviks. 703 deputies were elected to the Constituent Assembly. Of those 703, the Bolsheviks had only 168, so just 23.7% of the total. Again, with massive peasant turnout, the SRs do very well, right? They get 38%, 380 deputies, so they are the largest party that will have influence in the Constituent Assembly when it meets. But I want to draw your attention here to this horrible turnout for the cadets, the liberals, and the Mensheviks. Again, the cadets, as we've seen, the liberals, their membership is sorely confined to urban, middle-class, liberal, westernized intellectuals. That's a small segment of the population, and the cadets have lost a lot of respect in the eyes of the Russian people for their decision as part of the provisional government to keep fighting the war. The Mensheviks are almost totally discredited. All of their foot dragging, all of their vacillation on speeding the revolution forward has meant that anyone who's inclined to support a Marxist agenda in 1917 has thrown his or her lot in with the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks are so marginalized as to be all but insignificant. What you see here, though, is that no one party has a 50% majority. The SRs dominate, but what is going to happen in the Constituent Assembly? That is an open question. Now, these are the grand totals. These are the national totals, if you will. If we break down these numbers and look at specific geographical parts of the empire, the former empire, you get a sense of where the Bolsheviks' strengths and weaknesses lie, where they have support, where they don't have support. So nationally, right, the Bolsheviks get 24% of the vote, which is higher than Lenin had predicted. Where does the Bolsheviks' support lie? Well, let's look at the returns from Petrograd province. Here, the Bolsheviks get nearly 50% of the vote. Again, Petrograd is the citadel of the revolution. That's where the revolution happened. The Bolsheviks are strongest in Petrograd, so it stands to reason that they would have such a high turnout. And look how paltry the Menshevik showing is by contrast. The SRs do far worse in Petrograd than they do nationally. The cadets do better in Petrograd because, again, it's an urban base, lawyers, professors, professionals, etc., who vote cadet. So the Bolsheviks do well in these urban provinces. They do great in Moscow. Look at this, 56.5%, and a similar distribution among the cadets, SRs, and Mensheviks. But let's go out to Kursk province, where Elena Alitskaya, the author of last week's account of 1917, where Elena Alitskaya lived. Remember, she identified with the SRs. Her sister was a Bolshevik. Her mother was a Menshevik. And in this overwhelmingly rural province, the Bolsheviks are completely outnumbered electorally by the SRs, who get 82% of the vote in Kursk province. The Bolsheviks with a mere 11.3%. The Mensheviks, horrible showing, 0.5%. The cadets barely above water at 4.5%. Again, the cadets and Mensheviks are thoroughly discredited, thoroughly tainted by association with the late and unlamented provisional government. Now, the war is still going on in the fall of 1917, so you have to get the soldiers' votes in. And the soldiers are voting for the Constituent Assembly based on where they're stationed. So here you have the whole western front of the Russian army. This shows you just how Bolshevized, just how radicalized the Russian army, the rank and file, had become. So dispirited were they with fighting the war, so attracted were they by the Bolshevik message. Look at this, 66.9%, 67%, more than 2/3 of the Russian soldiers who cast votes for the election to the Constituent Assembly throw their lot in with the Bolsheviks. Good showing for the SRs, considering that so many soldiers come from peasant stock, but no soldiers are listening, of course, to the cadets or the Mensheviks. So the point I want to make here, if we look at these numbers nationally, Bolshevik support is not great. We could interpret this or extrapolate from this to say that, less than a quarter of the Russian population supports the Bolshevik program. That is not a mandate for reform, or at least not the reform that the Bolsheviks want to hammer through. Again, that support is stronger in the urban centers, weaker in the rural provinces out in the countryside, but fortunately for the Bolsheviks, strong with the army, because the army has guns. So if you're going to hold on to power, best to have the soldiers behind you. The Constituent Assembly, let me just go back here, I'm out of pictures, but the Constituent Assembly holds its first and last meeting on January 5th, 1918. They meet in the Tauride Palace in Petrograd. Lenin and the Bolsheviks again decide, well, we have to let the Constituent Assembly convene, but we'll do everything in our power to marginalize it. The Bolsheviks put the entire city under martial law. They outlaw public gatherings in the streets. They flood the city with Red Guard militia troops. And there's 50,000 soldiers in the streets, loyal to the Bolsheviks, ready to put down any trouble if it should emerge. When the Constituent Assembly begins its deliberations, Bolshevik soldiers are standing in the doorway, fingering their rifles, brandishing their bayonets. One of the SR delegates takes to the floor and asks, why is the meeting hall filled with Bolshevik soldiers? Why are there Red Guardsmen in the meeting hall of the Constituent Assembly? And one of the Bolshevik delegates says, for your protection, to make sure that nothing untoward might happen on this momentous occasion. They're here for security. And the SR delegate says, whose security? And the Bolshevik just shrugs. The Bolshevik delegation, the 24% bloc of Bolsheviks who held the seats in the Constituent Assembly, had asked that the Constituent Assembly recognize the Council of People's Commissars as the legitimate government of Russia. Lenin was hoping that this could at least counteract the poor showing that the Bolsheviks had had in the elections. If by chance the Constituent Assembly could say, yes, we recognize Sovnarkom, yes, we recognize the Constituent Assembly, the Constituent Assembly, recognize the Council of People's Commissars as the legitimate government, perhaps social disorder could be staved off. But the Constituent Assembly says, no, we do not recognize the Council of People's Commissars as the legitimate government. We have been sent here, members of the Constituent Assembly, we have been sent here by the people of Russia to draft a new constitution, to set Russia on a new political course, and that's what we're about to do. The Constituent Assembly, God love them, they stay in session all night long. At 4 a.m., members of the Red Guard, sleepy, angry, hungry, tired, step up to the podium and tap the speaker on the shoulder. The speaker is Viktor Chernov, the leader of the SR party. And they say, Citizen Chernov, it's time to go home. We're tired. And Chernov says, we're all tired, but we have an historic mission before us. right? We are here to establish a new, free, democratic Russia. And the Red Guards say, you don't understand. We're tired, and it's time for you to go home. Again, the Red Guards have soldiers. Chernev declares the meeting adjourned. We'll reconvene tomorrow. Well, the very next day, when the delegates return to the palace for day 2 of the Constituent Assembly, they find that the doors have been locked and the premises have been cordoned off by Red Guardsmen. So the first truly democratically elected parliament in Russian history ends after less than 24 hours. It is strangled by the Bolsheviks. So to wrap up here, I want to again sort of reflect on these dilemmas of state creation and the sort of paradox that lies, I think, at the heart of the Bolshevik project of building a new Russia. Remember, the Bolsheviks come to power in October on a wave of deep popular support, deep but not broad. The Bolsheviks are the darlings of the workers, the darlings of the soldiers and sailors, but they have little support outside of those key constituencies. And that's critical to understanding the course of policy making that the Bolsheviks will undertake. In their first weeks and months in power, the Bolsheviks take energetic steps to exclude any dissenting voices from the new government. In retrospect, this is a, let's not say fatal, but certainly a decisive decision. By excluding Mensheviks, by excluding SRs, all but the most radical, by excluding the liberals, there's no room for alternative visions to be articulated. There's no room for healthy dissent in the new post-October political landscape, right? Dissent will not be tolerated. This will be a one-party state, not a multi-party system. And the Bolsheviks' high-handed treatment of the Constituent Assembly is good evidence, I think, of the dismissive manner in which the Bolsheviks are prepared to deal with opposition and dissent, right? Should opposition emerge, we will merely decree it out of existence, and we'll use the threat of force or actual force if necessary. So with the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly at the beginning of January 1918, and with the amped up measures that we'll talk about next time taken by the state security police against political opponents, what this means is that by the beginning of 1918, just weeks after October, we can begin to talk about a one-party state, right? A one-party system. And the one party that will tolerate and brook no opposition is the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks had come to power in the name of the people, at the will of the Soviets, but the Bolsheviks, the party, is calling the shots. The party controls this dictatorship of the proletariat. Its back is to the wall. It will use force if necessary. And that, I think, is an important point. It's what I want to close on here. The Bolsheviks are prepared and willing, eager to use violence, if necessary, to hold on to power. And what we see, again, the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly is just one example of many. The Bolsheviks adopt coercive tactics and judge them as morally acceptable if they serve the interests of the revolution. So I want to think in our next lecture about how state-sponsored violence becomes a tool in the Bolsheviks' kit for the building of a new world. How do the Bolsheviks, who had rejected the revolutionary bomb throwing of the SRs in the years leading up to the revolution, how do they come to now endorse violence as an acceptable tactic in the service of revolution? So that's the point we're going to talk about next time. I'm going to stop the shit. Whoop, shit. Excuse me. Sorry. I'm going to stop the video, and we will